Who was he lending the
Discuss.
money to?
Village of Bronxville. So, anyway, welcome. 61 years later,
I don't know where they are today.
1963. They're here, they're coming in. 1963, and I was with my uncle and my grandfather at about this time, 2 hours after the assassination. And there is Jackie, and there is John F. Kennedy, and John Connally, who is the governor of Texas.
In the front.
In the front, yeah. The governor of Texas, who was also wounded in what was going on. Also in 1963, Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, with the I Have a Dream speech in Washington. Vietnam, well, there were troops there in Vietnam. There were sit-ins and no services at lunch counters like this Woolworth lunch counter in the South. There were demonstrations and arrests. Here is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King being arrested in Birmingham, Alabama. The space race and the Cold War are continuing, then the military mission going into space, and the Soviets have a woman astronaut by the name of Valentina Tereshkova. The Americans would not have a woman in space for 2 decades after this. John Kennedy is in Berlin, gives the I Am a Berliner speech. George Wallace stopped African Americans from entering the University of Alabama for about 5 minutes, and that was the end of that. Beatlemania erupts in Europe. In fact, the Beatles and John F. Kennedy's assassination have something in common on November 22nd, 1963. We start here in Dallas. That's me down here. This is the year 2000, 24 years ago. And up here is where Lee Harvey Oswald was, the shooter. And I'm pretty convinced he was the shooter because all the evidence points that way, even though there have been thousands of conspiracies or conspiracy theories. And up the street here in the grassy knoll, all the people with their theories are out there selling books and all that other stuff if you really are interested. I do have a question for you. Was the Kennedy assassination the end of the 1950s innocence? Yes or no? Or was there ever an innocence of the 1950s? Some people will say yes, but if you look at the United States, there was Korean War, Cold War, the Jim Crow laws. There was never any such thing as the innocence of the 1950s, although it was portrayed that way. By the way, only one person in this picture is still alive, and that's Carolyn Kennedy. This Carolyn Kennedy. This is a statue or monument in Bronxville, New York. John Kennedy actually spent the years 1927 until he went off to college in Bronxville. Robert Kennedy, when the family moved to Bronxville, was 3 years old, spent most of his childhood in Bronxville. Ted Kennedy was born in Bronxville, and Joe Kennedy lent Bronxville money during the Depression, and in exchange for that, Joe Kennedy said no Jews, no Negroes in Bronxville, and that was a policy they carried until about 15 years ago. Anyway, on this marker at the bottom in Bronxville, this was the last marker put up about John Kennedy, where he lived. At the bottom it said, local man elected president of the United States. This is 1963. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis in the rearview mirror. Cold War tensions between the US and the USSR continue. The two countries install a hotline between Moscow and Washington. 15,000 American advisors are stationed in South Vietnam. There were no protests at that point. Why? Because there were no draftees in South Vietnam. It was all enlisted men and people from the service academies. And the civil rights movement continues with demonstrations in American southern states. This is about a day or two before John Kennedy takes office, January 18th, 1961. And he's talking to Dwight Eisenhower, and they're meeting to talk about what's going on in the world from Eisenhower's viewpoint, what you need to look at, what you need to pay special attention to. And Eisenhower said, South Vietnam is not your biggest problem. It's Laos. It is
What?
Laos
Oh.
that is your biggest problem. Why isn't South Vietnam your biggest problem? Because we got our guy there, Diem. And Diem is the guy who is the only guy who's standing between communism and freedom in South Vietnam. Diem was as corrupt as could be. He was totally corrupt, but he was the American corrupt guy, so it wasn't all that bad. He's keeping Ho Chi Minh out of the South. Anyway, Diem, assisted by U.S. military and economic aid beginning around 1955 after the French pulled out of Indochina, was able to resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees from North Vietnam to the South. But he was a Catholic, and because he was a Catholic, he had some bias against the Buddhists being the largest population in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, there's this old thing called the domino theory. The guy pushing the dominoes is Stalin in the USSR, or maybe Khrushchev by this point. It was Dwight Eisenhower's view that if Laos fell, then Vietnam would fall, and Taiwan would fall, and South Korea would fall, and the Philippines, and Japan, and Canada, and eventually the United States. Now, the dominoes fell in China in 1949 with Mao Zedong. China becomes communist or Red China, and then 1950 in North Korea, and that was backed by the Soviet Union and Stalin in 1950. Kennedy advocated for U.S. involvement in Vietnam when he was a senator from Massachusetts in 1956. In 1954, Eisenhower had a view that you lose Vietnam to the communists and you will see others fall, whether it's Laos or Cambodia or Thailand or India or Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, even Australia and New Zealand. 1963 starts out very poorly for John Kennedy in the United States and Vietnam. 3 dead in the Battle of Apak. The United States loses those troops on January 2nd. The Viet Cong claimed the victory after it shot down U.S. helicopters. An American officer was killed, and 3 other American servicemen were injured in the action. The Battle of Apak was the first major combat victory by the Viet Cong against the South Vietnamese Army of the Republic of Vietnam and U.S. forces. That is napalm. You know what napalm is?
Yes, it's a chemical that
It's
you
a
could
chemical
just
that, yeah, if it hits your skin, it burns
skin
right
comes
down.
off.
Yeah, it goes right down
Remember
to the
that
bone.
famous picture with
Yeah.
the girl that was running down
Yeah.
the street?
Yeah. Well, you know, the first anti-war demonstration on American college campuses was in 1967. It wasn't against the Vietnam War. It was against Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical made this stuff, napalm, and they were trying to recruit people who were taking science,
College
biology,
was it?
whatever they were at the University of Wisconsin
Oh.
to work for Dow Chemical, and that is the first massive college demonstration against the war, but it happened to be against Dow Chemical. Meanwhile, there's a segregationist in Alabama by the name of George Wallace, and he takes office on January 14th, becoming the governor of Alabama. In his inaugural address, he promises segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. January 16th, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, goes to visit his client state in East Germany and East Berlin, and he makes a visit to the Berlin Wall on the East Berlin side, of course. Then he delivers an address to the communist leadership of East Germany at the SED Party Congress. He claimed the USSR had a 100 megaton bomb, nuclear bomb, which means that you could go like that, duck and cover, because that's what you were doing in those days if you were a student like I was. Mrs. Toper in first grade had a big, big problem with me. I was skipped. Anyway, I should have been in kindergarten, but they put me in first grade because I had too big a mouth. Anyway, she said, "Get down there." "No, I don't want to. If they're going to kill me, let me stand up." Well, she never explained why you ducked and covered. You ducked because the radiation rises.
Oh.
You cover to keep yourself from the shrapnel, so your head wouldn't be injured. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong from China and Nikita Khrushchev from the Soviet Union are not getting along anymore. Relations between the Soviet Union and China reach a breaking point as the two governments engage in an angry ideological debate about the future of communism. In June, officials from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China meet in Moscow. Chinese government's very upset with the government of Nikita Khrushchev. They became critical of what they referred to as the counter-revolutionary trends in the Soviet Union. Now think of this. You are supposed to be the dictator of the Soviet Union. You know, you're supposed to present this image of toughness. 1959, Nikita Khrushchev wants to go to Disneyland. Walt Disney says, no, we don't have the security. Here's the tough guy from the Soviet Union can't get into Disneyland. What kind of country is America? Well, instead, he ends up at the movie studios. And he's a lecherous old man who's pinching the rear ends of actresses. And they can't do anything about it because he's the dictator of the Soviet Union. So this dictator has gone soft, and the Chinese notice it. China was unhappy with the Soviet Union's policy of cooperation with the West. Later in 1963, October the 10th, the nuclear test ban, the first test ban agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, is ratified by the U.S. Senate. The agreement banned the above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. I don't know how many of you here have ever heard of Harvey Gantt. 1996, he ran for Senate, state of North Carolina. He ran against the segregationist Republican candidate, the incumbent Jesse Helms, and lost. But he does have a footnote in history. On January 28th, Harvey Gantt enters Clemson University in South Carolina. That was the last American state to hold out against racial discrimination. On May 28th, students and faculty from Tugaloo College staged a sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Jackson, Mississippi. They were beaten as police watched. I knew a guy by the name of Fred, worked at United Press between 1958 and 1962. He's covering the civil rights movement in the South. And he was telling me that, he said, cops roll in on these things. All of these disturbances, he said, the cops they knew all about it. They turned the other way, or worse yet, they participated in that. Now, Fred was taken out of his beat, off his beat in 1962. Jewish guy from New York, reported too much, death threats, so UP sent him back to New York. Hoping to avoid further disturbances, the owner of the Jackson Woolworths closed the lunch counter shortly after the sit-in. How many of you read this book, Feminine Mystique?
Heard about it.
Heard about it. You read the book? What'd you think about the book?
I remember.
You remember it?
No, I
Okay.
didn't read it either.
Yeah. Well, it comes out in 1963, and it's written by Betty Friedan, who had graduated college as a psychologist but never pursued a career. She wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1962-63 when she was a suburban housewife in Grandview-on-the-Hudson, New York. If you're familiar with the Tappan Zee Bridge, take exit 10, you go south, it's Nyack, South Nyack, and then Grandview-on-the-Hudson, which has a Grandview-on-the-Hudson because the houses are up on the cliffs. She was a mother who supplemented her husband's income by writing freelance articles for women's magazines. She intended to write a magazine article on her life, but all the editors she dealt with said, Betty has gone daft. She's gone off the wall. Why would we want to know about her life and the life of women? Well, she was writing about the gradual change of the American woman from the independent, career-minded women of the 1920s into the 1930s, the flappers. And those women, some of them had to do men's jobs during World War I, and they succeeded, and they wanted more. They wanted a job, they wanted a paycheck, and that was going on in the 1920s. But after World War II, they became vacant apron housewives of the post-war years. And there is Betty Friedan. The Feminine Mystique started out as a survey that she conducted in 1957 for the 15th reunion of her graduating class at Smith College. It was intended to refute a prevailing post-war myth that higher education kept women from adapting to their roles as wives and mothers. So she wanted to know, you graduated Smith College, you got a degree, you got presumably a good education at Smith College, and you're a housewife. What do you think? Well, the responses were pretty much this: a nameless, aching dissatisfaction that she, Betty Friedan, would call the problem that has no name. That a woman, educated woman, felt unsuccessful because she wasn't able to work at her trade. Not that she didn't mind being a mother, but she really wanted an opportunity and never got it. She sent the same questionnaire to graduates of Radcliffe and other colleges, later interviewed scores of women personally. The results were the same. The women's answers gave her the context and content of what was to be a magazine piece. But again, the magazine editor said she's gone off the wall, she's crazy. We don't want to do it. So she decides to write a book. And that book would be the foundation of the start of what is called, or was called at the time, women's liberation. The book pushed Congress. It's Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem is a Playboy bunny in 1963. Fast forward here to 1978, 79. I was a young guy, I was 22 years old, and I was going out with a woman by the name of Charlene Amelick, and it's okay to use her name because I wrote about her in the newspaper article. And she was 23, she was slightly older than me. And she was an art major at Boston University, and she ended up being a art teacher down in Union City, New Jersey. Anyway, she enters the Miss America pageant. And before you get to Atlantic City, you got to do the steps. You got to win your local pageant, you got to win the local pageant, then you got to go to the state pageant, and then you get to go to Atlantic City back in those days. And I was talking to her one day, and I said to her, I want to do a story. Well, why would you want to do a story on me? I said, well, I don't know, I'm your boyfriend right now. That didn't last too much longer after that. Why not? It's okay. I got my wife to sing at Madison Square Garden national anthem, so I was always pushing. Anyway, so she said, okay, all right, why don't we do this story? So I said, you're objectified. You knew that old men were gonna, lecherous old men that were gonna look at your butt and basically grade you by your butt? And she said, yeah. I said, so why are you doing this? She said, just for the experience. And I said, okay. I said, her father was the assistant district attorney in Manhattan, and they lived in Tapan, so she didn't need the money because she got a $500 scholarship, some nonsense like that. College scholarship, because the pageant was in those days anyway, I don't know if it is today anymore, a chance to win a college scholarship. So I said, okay, tell me the tricks of the trade. She said, well, I could go from a 34B to a 36C in a matter of seconds. I could put padding in the rear end of my swimsuit. I could put Vaseline on my teeth, and you put Vaseline on your teeth, you tend to continue smiling. And those are some of the tricks of the trade. And then she said, what size shoe do you take? I said, why? She said, what size shoe do you take? I said, size 12. This was the very early part of our relationship. Although, in retrospect, it was almost the end of the relationship, in retrospect. But anyway, we left on good terms anyway, and I still hear from her through her attorney, her divorce attorney, who happened to be somebody I went to high school with. Anyway, make a long story short. She said, that won't do. I said, what do you mean it won't do? She said, I wanted you to do the walk in high heels. Well, I couldn't do it because her shoe was 7 and mine was 12. But basically, she's showing me how you walk up and down the catwalk with the right wiggle to make sure that the lecherous men who are judging you, it was all guys 50 and over judging, and she's 23 at the time, and that's what it was all about. She was objectified for a college scholarship. Well, she goes up to the pageant in Rochester, but she doesn't win. Same story here. That was 1978-79. This is 1963 with Gloria Steinem. She's a political activist who helped create New York and Ms. magazines and was co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, Free the Bee Foundation, Women's Media Center, and Women's Action Alliance. She was a journalist, and she went undercover as a Playboy bunny, different name. She was older. They didn't care that she was older. Different name, and she kept her name out. And anyway, she does a story about what it was like to work as a bunny at the 59th Street Club, the Playboy Club. Anybody here ever go to a Playboy Club? No? I dated a Playboy bunny. Anyway, the world she found was one of stuffed bosoms, low pay, and high heels. Sounds like Charlene, right? Sounds just like her. The story ran in shows May and June issues. It was a story called A Bunny's Tale. The Steinem piece was the struggle of women who more or less were objectified for a living. Steinem had hoped that a change would be coming soon. And there was kind of a change coming soon. That's Eleanor Roosevelt here. Edith Green is over here. Edith Green was a congresswoman from Oregon who was elected in 1954, and she gets up to the Hill, and the first legislation she tries to get across is something called the Equal Pay Act. Now I'm going to ask this question, and I know if anybody answers this wrong, you're going to be chased out of the room. But how many people think that a woman and a man should be paid the same amount of money for a job if they have the equal amount of experience, equal amount of education? Should a woman get the same money as a man?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Edith Green in 1955 proposes that. Here is Kennedy on June the 10th, 1963, the Equal Pay Act, and he signs it into law. Congress stated that sex discrimination depresses wages and living standards for employees, prevents the maximum utilization of available labor resources, and is not evenly enforced, or was not evenly enforced. And to this day, it has not been evenly enforced. There's still a gap between men and women in pay. The women's movement would become the United States' second civil rights movement. Does the name Saddam Hussein ring a bell? Saddam Hussein. He makes his debut in 1963. Actually, he did 4 years earlier, but he comes back in 1963. The Ramadan Revolution, or the February 8th Revolution, was a coup d'etat in Iraq, military coup by the Ba'ath Party's Iraqi wing, which overthrew the 5-year-old regime of the Prime Minister of Iraq, Abd al-Karim Qasim. Saddam Hussein would return to power to Iraq after a 4-year exile, with the Ba'ath Party taking power. Oh, why was he thrown out of Iraq or fled Iraq? He tried to kill this guy, Abd al-Karim Qasim, in 1959, and he fled. Nice guy, Saddam Hussein, wasn't he? Nice guy. Meanwhile, that is al-Assad. That's Hafez al-Assad in Syria in 1963. His family is still running Syria. There was a Ba'ath Party coup in Syria back in 1963 in March. The revolution was engineered by the military committee of the Syrian regional branch of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. The coup was planned by the military rather than the civilian leadership, which was led by Michel Afak. But he said, okay, go ahead, do what you have to do. 3 guys take over: Mohammed Amram, Salah Jadid, and Hafez al-Assad, who was a terrible leader. If you look at the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, just always on the losing side. Okay, John Kennedy was a politician. That's what he was. He was no more than a politician. He wasn't a mythical figure. He was a politician. He was something of a polarizing politician, but not really. But he wants to be reelected in 1964. And he realizes he has two problems that he can't solve. because if he solves them, he may lose the presidential election. And here is a demonstration. Freedom Now, NAACP, Fight and Work, Freedom, NAACP. It's the civil rights movement. Any other problem is Vietnam. JFK was very, and I can't repeat very's enough, slow in supporting the civil rights movement in 1961 and 1962. He would, in a way, support, remember the Freedom Riders and the Freedom Fighters? Well, in 1961, he, to a certain extent, supports them. The Kennedy brothers, John, the president, and the attorney general, Robert, were able to end segregation on interstate buses in November 1961. But there's a catch to that. The Supreme Court did that in 1946 in the Irene Morgan versus Virginia case, and was never enforced. Finally, it was enforced, and that allowed African Americans living in the North to take buses to the South and participate in civil rights rallies. James Meredith is right here. He's trying to go to the University of Mississippi in the fall of 1962. He wants to enroll, but the segregationist governor, Ross Barnett, vowed to block Meredith from attempting classes, even though the federal government backed his right to attend school and to sign up for classes. Meredith once again tried to register for classes, this time around October, this time with federal marshals at his side. Rioting erupted on the campus, 2 people were killed. Unfortunately for the United States, one of the people who was killed was a French photojournalist. So it becomes a large story in France about the United States civil rights movement and Jim Crow and everything else. Kennedy did send federal troops to the campus, and Meredith eventually was able to attend class. In November 1962, Kennedy did issue an executive order to end housing discrimination. Kennedy ignored calls from civil rights leaders that he introduced civil rights legislation. Very simple. He introduces civil rights legislation, the entire South, which was solidly Democrat, would leave. They'd leave because he all of a sudden, and he knew this from 1960, that the segregationists were not happy. He was elected president from the Democratic Party. So he says, okay, we'll wait. Intimidation. This is the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and which is kind of an odd place because half of it is about cars and half of it is about the civil rights movement and the Ku Klux Klan, the intimidation. And this is my wife, also Henry Ford Museum, in between the white waiting room at a bus station or a train station, nice and clean. The colored waiting room, filthy, filled with mildew, not kept up. That was part of the United States as late as 1963. And I got a question for you. How many of you went to the old Penn Station on 7th Avenue and 33rd Street? Not the thing today where Madison Square Garden's over it, but the old structure. Well, if you went to the old structure, if you look close enough, you would find 2 sets of water fountains. One said whites only, the other said colored only.
It happened
New York
in
City.
Coral Gables as well.
Yeah,
They
well,
had those same
yeah,
signs.
Yeah, well,
Those were
that's Florida, but in New York, the middle of New York, in 1963, you had that. That's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's in Birmingham, Alabama, and he is being arrested. And he becomes prisoner 7089. It was April 12th, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Good Friday violated a court injunction prohibiting civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. Local police officers arrested King and a handful of supporters, including the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, transported them to the Birmingham City Jail, where 40 years earlier, the prisoner penned a mournful folk ballad about the place that included the line, "Write me a letter, send it by mail, send it in care of the Birmingham jail." Well, why was Martin Luther King writing letters from the Birmingham jail? Well, he's there for 8 days. And his basic thing is, I am going to tell these white ministers who say, Martin, why are you involved? Why are you there? I'm going to write to them, telling them why I'm involved. Those pieces of paper were given to his lawyers. It becomes known as the letter from Birmingham jail, the most important written document of the civil rights era. He basically said he was fighting injustice. Go back to 1946, and he's 17 years old. And there is a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution newspaper. And it's signed, or it's printed, M.L. King, Morehouse College. He was 17. The basic thing, the basic letter to the editor ends with the, I'm fighting injustice. So he doesn't deviate. Television would bring these images into your home. Television starts becoming very important to the civil rights movement in 1957, showing what is going on in Little Rock, Arkansas, when the Little Rock Nine tried to enter Central High School and were denied, and Eisenhower declared war on the American city, sending the 101st Airborne Division in there to accompany those students. So people are getting used to images like that. Here the Birmingham Fire Department is spraying demonstrators with high-powered water coming out of the hydrants and knocking them down. Birmingham, Alabama officials' reaction to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.-led demonstrations changed perceptions. Television caught police beatings of nonviolent marchers, firemen turning their high-pressure hoses on defenseless men, women, and children, police dogs shredding the clothing of demonstrators on video. The New York Times, Abe Rosenthal was the executive editor in those days. It was a real piece of work, as my friend Bob Lipsyte told me, and he worked there. The New York Times and Southern newspapers were ignoring the civil rights movement for the most part. However, there was a photojournalist in Birmingham on May 3rd, and he takes this picture, which ends up on the cover of the May 4th New York Times, Walter Gadsden being attacked by dogs with the police right there, not stopping the dogs. Walter Gadsden, 17-year-old civil rights demonstrator, defying an anti-parade ordinance in Birmingham, Alabama, is attacked by a police dog May 3rd. May 4th, Kennedy is having a meeting in the White House, and he's shaken to his core when he sees that picture, and he begins to discuss what's going on looking at that picture. The fire hoses, Birmingham, Alabama, May 8th, this woman is soaked, demonstrating because they decided to go after this woman. And then there's Vietnam. And Kennedy in April says, we don't have a prayer staying in Vietnam. That's what he tells his friend. Those people hate us. They're going to throw our asses out of there at a point. I can't give up that territory to the communists and get the American people to re-elect me. Kennedy is shaken by Alabama and realizes Vietnam is a lost cause. Except there's a problem. He can't back down, or he's not going to be re-elected in his mind in 1964. The world is watching, more fire hoses knocking down protesters. Here is a dummy that's about ready to get hung or hanged. Keep Birmingham schools white. The New York Times, the mighty New York Times, which in 1917 dismissed a whole bunch of women in Washington trying to get the right to vote, just dismissed them as silly. New York Times published more stories about the civil rights movement in the 2 weeks, the Birmingham between Martin Luther King being arrested and the guard dogs, than it had in the previous 2 years. Televised scenes of children campaigning against rigid segregation, being bitten by dogs, knocked off their feet by water fired with enough power to rip bark off a tree, caused international outrage. Well, it's June 11th. June 11th becomes a big, big day in 1963. George Wallace is in Birmingham, Alabama. John Kennedy's in Washington about ready to give a speech. And Medgar Evers is going about his business in Jackson, Mississippi. George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door. The governor of Alabama, who came to national prominence when he kept a campaign pledge to stand in the schoolhouse door to block integration of Alabama's public schools. Wallace read a proclamation when he stood in the doorway to block the attempt of two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, to register at the University of Alabama. Oddly enough, later on in his life, George Wallace and James Hood became very good friends. But in 1963, Wallace is saying, you can't go into this institution. But Kennedy federalizes the National Guard, orders its units to the university campus. Wallace this was all for show. Steps aside, goes back to the Capitol in Montgomery, and the students enter. Well, while that's going on, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, well, they are making plans for a march on Washington. It is June 11th, the same day as President Kennedy addresses the nation on civil rights. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference announced plans to demonstrate in Washington for new civil rights legislation. The group calls for a massive, militant, monumental sit-ins on Congress and massive acts of civil disobedience all over the nation. Kennedy does make that speech, but they don't know what they're talking about. It's a nice speech, it sounds flowery, but there's no teeth to it. They don't know what to do. They honestly do not know what to do, because there's an election in '64. A few hours later, the civil rights activist Medgar Evers is killed. John Kennedy sort of joins the civil rights movement on June 11th, 1963. Gives a speech. Like I said, gives a speech, sounds nice, but there's nothing in there. Ought to be possible for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. Ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. It ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. Ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy privileges of being an American without regard to his pronoun trouble here. There's some pronoun trouble, but it's 1963. This is the way people talk. Pronoun trouble. Without regards to his race or his color. Shouldn't that be his or her race or his or her color or their race, their color? It's 1963. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he, not they, he would wish to be treated as one would wish his children to be treated. But that's not the case. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free, nor are their granddaughters. Medgar Evers is assassinated early morning hours, June 12th, which would be still in Hawaii, June 11th on American territory. On May 28th, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the garage of his home. 5 days before his death, he was nearly run down by a car after he emerged from the Jackson, Mississippi NAACP office. In Jackson, on June 12th, Evers pulled into his driveway after returning from an integration meeting where he conferred with NAACP lawyers. Emerging from his car, carrying NAACP T-shirts that stated Jim Crow must go, was struck in the back with a bullet that ricocheted into his home. Staggered 30 feet before collapsing, dying in a hospital 50 minutes later. It took 31 years to find his killer and convict him. 1994, Evers' killer, Byron D. La Beckwith, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. It's a movie starring Alec Baldwin about this case that came out in the 1990s. 31 years. I'm surprised they even bothered, because normally in the South in those days it didn't bother. JFK meets with the Evers family afterwards. Evers and his wife Merle established the NAACP office in Jackson, Mississippi in the mid-1950s. He led marches, prayer vigils, voter registration drives, and boycotts. As early as 1955, he was on death lists. But he persisted to appeal to blacks and whites to work together for a peaceful solution to social problems.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're having a 4 o'clock kiddish upstairs for Channel 8. Chavez, supposed want to join us. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, no problem. Anyway, Evers orchestrated boycotts of white merchants in Jackson in the early 1960s. Well, again, the Kennedys, they got to do something. They have no plan. There is no plan. So they send Bobby Kennedy out to address protesters on June 14th, free them now, all this other stuff. But he has nothing to say.
Wasn't necessary.
While Robert Kennedy is talking, John Kennedy is in Berlin. And it's the Cold War. And he's checking out the Berlin Wall, and he gives his famous I am a Berliner speech. There aren't many people in the world who really don't understand. There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is a wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say in Europe and elsewhere we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it is true, communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass them nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. A. Philip Randolph. Anybody here ever hear of A. Philip Randolph?
Yes.
Civil rights pioneer,
Yes.
the lawyer for the train strike, all that other stuff. Okay, he's right there. Kennedy is there. Martin Luther King is there. And he plans a civil rights march as well. With A. Philip Randolph planning a march for jobs, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Larry McCoy will like that, because when I was working at CBS, he said that's his real name, as opposed to his father, who was senior. Anyway, and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference planning One for Freedom, 2 groups decide to merge their efforts to make one protest. Randolph and his chief aide, Bayard Rustin, their march would call for fair treatment and equal opportunity for black Americans, as well as advocate for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And Randolph had been around the block by this point. This would be his 5th march. 1941, protest in Washington. Why should we march? 15,000 Negroes assembled. St. Louis, Missouri, 20,000 Negroes assembled. Chicago, Illinois, 23,500 Negroes assembled at New York City. Millions of Negro Americans all over this great land claim the right to be free. Free from want, free from fear, free from Jim Crow. He had led marches before, 1941, 3 of them in the 1950s for school integration. In 1941, with blacks excluded from jobs in the defense industry, he began traveling the country, rallying potential marches with this message: we, loyal Negro American citizens, demand the right to work and fight for our country. Well, Franklin Roosevelt invites him to the White House. He might not have wanted to, but Eleanor said, invite him now. Invite him. She did. You know, in 1936, after the Berlin Olympics, Jesse Owens is the star of the Berlin Olympics, not invited to the White House. And you might remember Marian Anderson was denied singing in a federal place in Washington in 1939. But by this point, Roosevelt probably doesn't care, because he's been elected for a 3rd term in November of 1940. Anyway, he invites Randolph to the White House, June 25th, 1941. 6 days before the march was scheduled to take place, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in the government and defense industry. Well, these are the big 6. Young John Lewis there, and Whitney Young, and Randolph, and Martin Luther King, and Roy Wilkins, and Rustin. And they're at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York. Rustin, who was Randolph's assistant. On July 2nd, they meet at the Roosevelt Hotel. They're called the Big Six. Randolph gets everybody together in preparation for this March on Washington. And this is the demands they have for JFK in Congress. And if you look at this closely, it's not just for Black Americans. It's for women also. These are the demands. Comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation from the present Congress without compromise or filibuster to guarantee all Americans, access to public accommodations, decent housing, adequate and integrated education, the right to vote, withholding of federal funds from all programs in which discrimination exists. This is a march in Newark, New Jersey for us. Yes?
Is there anything written about the fact that those demands include women? I mean,
Wait.
I've
Y'all
never
get
heard
to
of
it.
He didn't get
I
there
didn't
yet.
get to that yet.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I didn't get to
Okay.
that yet.
Okay.
Anyway, desegregation of schools. Desegregation of all school districts in 1963. Enforcement of the 14th Amendment reducing congressional representation of states where citizens are disenfranchised. A new executive order banning discrimination in all housing supported by federal funds. Authority for the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits when any constitutional right is violated. It's for everybody across the board. A massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. Notice they don't use men or women. It's all in these demands. A national minimum wage that will give all Americans a decent standard of living. A broadened Federal Labor Standards Act from 1938. Elon Musk wants to get rid of it. He wants to get rid of it now. This has been around since 1938. To include all areas of employment which are presently excluded. A federal Fair Employment Practices Act, barring discrimination by federal, state, municipal governments, and by employers, contractors, employment agencies, and trade unions. It's for everybody. They left out purposely gender. It's for everybody, for everybody. Now, you know about 1964 and the Harlem riots, and 1965 in Watts, and 1968, the riots in Detroit and Newark. But nobody talks about what happened in 1963. In 1963 was probably, if you go back to 1919, was probably the summer that was filled, or most filled, with protests, with 1919 being up on top here. Anyway, it is a summer of protest. That's Los Angeles. Segregated schools must stop now. This is Cambridge, Maryland. And this is a guy who runs a segregated, maybe chuck wagon or lunchroom, whatever he is running. And this is a cracked egg on the back of this guy by the name of Edward Dickerson. And this guy cracked the egg over his head. That was Robert Faisenfeld, the owner of a segregated lunchroom in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He first poured water over the guy, then he cracked the egg over his head on July 8th. The integrationist, Edward Dickerson, was among 3 whites and 8 African-American protesters who knelt on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. They sung songs. The raw egg is on the back of his head, just dripping down. All 11 protesters were arrested. According to the United States Justice Department, in the 10 weeks before the August 28th March on Washington, there were 758 demonstrations. 758 demonstrations in 2 months. 186 cities. 14,733 arrests. That was going on in 1963. And it's funny because people talk about what went on in 64 and 65 and the summer of love in 67. They'll talk about 63. Cross burning, Chicago, Illinois, August 3rd. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'm standing next to a poster of him in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. There's a little area in Great Barrington where he grew up, and they said he grew up in that area. Whether he did or not is another story. But there's a little park going through the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he dies on August 27th. In 1905, Du Bois was the founder and General Secretary of the Niagara Movement, African-American protest group of scholars and professionals. He founded and edited The Moon in 1906 and The Horizon 1907 to 1910 as organs for the Niagara Movement. He ran for Senate, state of New York in 1950. That's his campaign poster. Great Negro, great American U.S. Senator. In 1909, he was among the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People with Jews and women and blacks found in the NAACP. From 1910 to 1934, he was the director of publicity and research, and he was the founder and editor of Crisis, the monthly magazine. He was a socialist, and this is the McCarthy era, Joe McCarthy era, and got in trouble, fled, went to Ghana, but never renounced his American citizenship. He died on August 27th, which was the night before this, the March on Washington. The March on Washington. So August 28th, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in protest. And Randolph was the guy who led off the day's speeches, closed his speech with a promise. We here today are only the first wave. When we leave, it will be to carry the civil rights revolution home with us into every nook, every cranny of the land. And we shall return again and again to Washington in ever-growing numbers until total freedom is ours.
What year was that?
63.
63.
This is August 28th, 1963,
Okay.
and Washington doesn't look like that anymore.
No.
The Smithsonian's been all built up. Well, the Washington Monument is there, and the mall's still there, but it's been built up.
Nice picture.
Other speakers included Rustin, the NAACP President Roy Wilkins, John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Civil Rights veteran Daisy Lee Bates, and the actors Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. And there was also entertainment. Marian Anderson was back. And Joan Baez was there. And Bob Dylan was there. And Mahalia Jackson was there. And there is a story
Mahalia Jackson.
about Mahalia Jackson. Now, whether this is a true story or not, it's hard to get down to the bottom of this because Martin Luther King is very, very, very vague, or was very, very vague about how this speech came about. He's up at the podium, and Mahalia Jackson yells out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King originally thought the speech should be lower key. He's speaking to a broad audience about controversial themes. He looked at the crowd, explains this in an interview eventually. All of a sudden, this thing came to me that I have used many times before. The thing about, I have a dream. Sorry about that. And I just felt that I wanted to use it here. Did he come up with it, or did Mahalia Jackson come up with it?
You don't know?
Lost in history. But he did do the speech, I have a dream. Now, I don't know how many of you used to listen to WCBS News Radio 88,
Maybe.
which is gone, died in August. Two of my friends who were there, J. Tillman Irving, Rich Lamb. Nice people, very nice people. Jane Tillman Irving, 2013, did a series of reports for WCBS Radio, 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. And she was there. She was there as a 17-year-old with her mother. Anybody see the movie Green Book?
No.
You did. Well, basically, the Green Book was this. It was put out by a guy in Harlem by the name of Victor Hicks, starting around 1935. And it was a list of places that Negroes could safely get gas, drive, get food, get lodging. That's what it was, the Green Book.
What year was that?
This started in 1935, lasted till about
Oh.
1965. Jane Tillman Irving goes down to Washington with her mother, and she is really pumped up. She's 17 years old. She's all pumped up and all that other stuff. And Jane's telling me the story. She gets down there, exhilarating, and then deflation. Inspiring speeches. This is the moment. But there's a reality. America is still a segregated nation. She's driving back to New York with her mother. She cannot get gas at the gas station. They don't serve Negroes. Hotels refuse Negroes. Nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. Great speech. Nothing had changed. Birmingham, Alabama, a couple weeks later, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. There was the bombing in Birmingham. It's September 15th, less than 3 weeks after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dynamite bomb planted by Klansmen explodes inside the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young girls. Anna Mae Collins, 14, she'd be 75 now. Denise McNair, 11, she'd be 72. Carol Robertson, 14, she'd be 75 today. 63. Cynthia Wesley, 14, she'd be 75 now. More than 20 others are injured in the attack that was timed to occur during a Youth Day tribute to local young people in the Birmingham campaign. The FBI concealed evidence. J. Edgar Hoover concealed evidence. But finally, Robert Chambliss was convicted of the murder in 1977. Thomas Blanton in 2001. Bobby Frank Cherry in 2002. A 4th bomber, Herman Cash, died in 1995. He was never indicted. They were all part of the Ku Klux Klan. How many of you remember Jay and the Americans? Slightly. Jay and the Americans. They sang.
They did something.
Yeah, they sang. David Blatt. There's David Blatt, who became Jay Black. Only in my life could this happen. I broke up with a girl named Marjorie, and a couple weeks later, she's dating David Blatt. Jay Black. He was to be about 15, 16 years older than she was at the time. Anyway, Only in America. Remember the song Only in America? Only in America. Okay. In April, the Drifters. Remember the Drifters?
I remember.
Yeah, remember that. Okay. Rhythm and Blues Group record the song containing the lyric, Only in America can a kid without a cent get a break and maybe grow up to be president. Could have been the next hit for the Drifters. But the Atlantic Records executive Jerry Wexler, who was from around here, pulled the plug. Wexler observed what was happening in the South. He thought it would be unfeeling, unfair, unfitting to have a black group release a song about America being a land of opportunity and suggest that an African American could become its president. The patriotic lyrics replaced Barry Mann and Cynthia Wilde, who were cranking out hits in those days, in 61 and 62, the original words. And here are the original words. Only in America, land of opportunity, can they save a seat in the back of the bus just for me. Only in America, where they preach the golden rule, will they start to march when my kids want to go to school. Well, the Drifters did record it. It was shelved. Atlantic Records executive told Mann and Wilde, rewrite the lyrics. They refused, and Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who did Hound Dog and Smoking Joe's Cafe, among others, plugged in those lyrics. Wexler gave the song to a predominantly Jewish group led by David Blatt, who changed his name to Jay Black, with Howie and Sandy and the others, and it did well, got to 25. At the time, no African American, no Jew had been president. The Drifters song was finally released in 1966, 33 years later. Sam Cooke did a song, A Change Is Gonna Come. Not yet. It's October 8th. Sam Cooke and his band are arrested for trying to register at a whites-only motel in Louisiana. In the months to follow, he records the song, A Change Is Gonna Come, but he never saw the change because he was killed. It becomes bloody now. It really becomes bloody. Diem is assassinated in South Vietnam. During the summer, Thich Quang Duc commits suicide. He's a Buddhist monk, and this picture goes around the world. He doused himself with gasoline, lit himself up, committed suicide, protesting Diem. The suppression of Buddhists in South Vietnam became known as the Buddhist crisis. Diem did almost nothing to relieve tensions. Yeah, health reform, he never did. And some thought it was his brother Nhu, who was the decision maker of the Saigon government and the person behind the Buddhist suppression. The demonstrations continued through the spring and summer. The monk puts himself on fire. Everybody sees it. David Halberstam wrote a book about the Kennedy administration, the best and the brightest, and they weren't. There were guys from Harvard and Yale.
Members of book.
Yeah, there were guys from Harvard and Yale who thought they knew everything.
Yeah.
Kennedy never listened to anybody except these guys. Eisenhower's cast adrift, even though he could at least provide some context. And he's going to hire a Republican for his cabinet, so he hires this guy, the whiz kid, Robert McNamara, who was a bean counter at Ford Motor Company. That's all he was. He was a bean counter. But anyway, these are the guys, the architect behind the Vietnam policy. Kennedy tried to impress on Diem the need for major government reforms in Saigon. Diem ignored the warnings. In August, Diem declared martial law. His forces raided the pagodas of the Budapest group behind the protests, or the Buddhist group behind the protests. Soon after, South Vietnamese military officers contacted U.S. government representatives and said, if we knock him off, if we kill him, will you be upset? You don't have to answer that right now, but would you be upset? Get back to us with an answer. Well, Eisenhower, Diem, here's the guy, only guy keeping South Vietnam falling from the communists. Diem, yeah, he's corrupt. Yeah, he's an SOB, but he's our SOB. Kennedy and Eisenhower, the U.S. had given millions of dollars to prop up the French in Vietnam. In 1955, after the French got out, the U.S. sent military advisors to support Diem, the corrupt but anti-communist government. On September 2nd, JFK gave an interview with Walter Cronkite in which he said the regime had gotten out of touch with the people. November 1st, they pulled the trigger. South Vietnamese generals used a strong military force to seize control of several strategically important outposts in Saigon and other areas of Vietnam. Initially, Diem and his brother refused to surrender. When it became clear they could not stop the coup from succeeding, the brothers used a secret exit to escape the presidential palace after dark. They were found at a Catholic church a few hours later, and a guy by the name of Dong Van Minh, also known as Big Ben, ordered their execution and assumed the leadership of the country. John Kennedy is absolutely stunned. He may have been corrupt, but he kept the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam. The second 1963 Iraqi coup d'etat took place between November 13th and 18th. The Ba'ath Party divisions, there were divisions. The pro-Nasserists, they were the ones who were following Nasser in Egypt, led the military coup within the Ba'ath Party. The coup was bloodless, but 250 people would be eventually killed. Nasser, the president of Egypt, wanted Arab unity. Okay, that brings us to 61 years ago. The breakfast. That's the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. But before I talk about the breakfast, I'm going to talk about a story a guy by the name of Marv Schneider got from this guy, Larry O'Brien. I knew Larry O'Brien when he was the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. Marv Schneider was with the Associated Press and the sports department, and they would have breakfast with league commissioners, and Larry O'Brien was a league commissioner. And Marv told me this story. I mean, Marv would be in his 90s now. He's about 25 years older than me. And he said, eventually you could use this story. I said, what is it? He said, Larry O'Brien and John Kennedy. And you have never heard this story. You're going to hear it for the first time. Kennedy goes to Texas November 20th. And it's a three-day swing through Texas campaigning. And brings with him Jackie. Jackie had lost the baby in September
I remember.
and was depressed, and they decided to wheel her out. The reason why? She was the secret weapon. Kennedy knew he was not very popular. He knew that. Jackie was 100% popular. People liked her. She was young. She was good looking. She was sophisticated. But she didn't give off those airs. She was Jackie Kennedy. She was a photojournalist at one point. She just lost the baby. He knew bringing her out would probably get votes. Anyway, so Larry is telling my friend Mark, the late Mark Stein, he says, JFK calls him. Want to take a walk? Can't take a walk when you're president of the United States. But get the Secret Service together. They decide they're going to walk around the roof of the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth. Secret Service scrambles, they go up to the roof, and they're walking around. It was raining, and it was misty, and it was cloudy. Kennedy and O'Brien are talking, and Kennedy says to O'Brien, you know, Larry, it's a great big world out there. They're going to get me, they're going to get me.
Really?
Well, it's raining. Rain plays a part in this. In front of the Fort Worth Hotel, or the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth, Lyndon Johnson over there, and they decide to send Kennedy out there. There are people waiting in the rain, send them out there. Light rain was falling on Friday morning, November 22nd, but a crowd of several thousand stood in the parking lot outside the Texas Hotel where the Kennedys had spent the night. Platform was set up. The president, wearing no protection against the weather, came out to make some brief remarks. No faint hearts in Fort Worth. And I appreciate you being here this morning. Mrs. Kennedy is, this is so chauvinistic, it's so 1960s. Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself. It takes longer, but of course she looks better than we do when she does. Went on to talk about the nation's need for being second to none in defense, in space, for continued growth in the economy, and the willingness of citizens of the United States to assume the burdens of leadership. Well, the final breakfast, and she does arrive. And look at her, she's radiant. She's got the pillbox hat. She's got the pink outfit, and she's looking out at the crowd. She's 34 years old. She's young. She's filled with life. The final breakfast. Inside the hotel, the president spoke at the breakfast of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, focusing on military preparedness. We are still the keystone in the Arch of Freedom. We will continue to do our duty, and the people in Texas will be in the lead. It was raining. However, they take the 9-minute flight or the 13-minute flight between Fort Worth and Dallas, which would take about 40 minutes by car, but they take a flight, and the sun is shining. Kennedy says, we don't need the bubble on top of the car. Let them see me. Let them see me. There it is. Crowds of people, excited people, lined the streets and waved to the Kennedys. The car turned off Main Street at Dealey Plaza around 12:30. As it was passing the Texas School Book Depository, gunfire suddenly reverberated in the plaza. And you know the rest of the story. He gets hit in the head, hit in the back. John Connally, the Texas governor, is also shot in the back, but he survived. I'm not going through the minute-by-minute ordeal of what was going on, just give you little pieces here and there. Old Iron Pants, Walter Cronkite, delivers the news. The president is dead. Takes down the glasses, sheds a tear, recomposes or composes himself. Old Iron Pants is back in the saddle, ready to go. With that, he becomes the most trusted man in America. Lee Harvey Oswald is arrested, not at first for the killing of Kennedy, but for the killing of the patrolman, J.D. Tippit. He had recently gotten a job at the Texas School Book Depository. He was in the movie theater when he was picked up. The route of the Kennedys was published in the newspapers 2 days beforehand. Too many stars did align for this, but my belief is it was just Oswald after looking at all the evidence. LBJ is sworn in by Sarah Hughes, the only federal judge ever to swear, female federal judge ever to swear in a president. And Jackie's with them. He wanted Jackie there for solidarity. Jackie wanted to show the world what they did to her husband. They go back to Washington. On Sunday morning, Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald as Oswald was being paraded around. They did this
That was so
openly.
stupid.
He was being paraded around. Jack Ruby owned a strip club and had free reign of the police department. How does that work? Anyway, so Jack Ruby, kills him, and there's all kind of stuff, like he did it for Jackie Kennedy, or he wanted to show that a Jew could have courage, all kind of different things that came out. Oswald died 2 hours later, and Jack Ruby was a strip club owner. The funeral was on Monday, the 25th. The funeral was attended by representatives from more than 100 countries. At the gravesite, Jackie Kennedy, Bobby and Ted Kennedy lit an eternal flame. Did you ever wonder what happened to that car?
No.
Okay, this is what happened to the car. This is
In a
the
museum?
Henry Ford Museum, and I'm going to read this to you. That's me in
Please.
front of the car. A tragic event occurred. This is a 1961 Lincoln, used from 1961 to 1977. The modern, new four-door convertible seemed well-suited to a young, forward-thinking president, but tragedy struck when President Kennedy was assassinated November 1963 while riding in his car through the streets of Dallas. As the world mourned, Secret Service quickly took steps to have this vehicle rebuilt so it would better protect future presidents. Later modifications during the Johnson's and Nixon's presidency only served to illustrate the continual tension between the president's desire to be seen and the Secret Service efforts to protect them. Used by John Kennedy, occasionally used by Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. They kept the car going. They kept
They
it
made it
going.
bulletproof.
Yeah, but
It wasn't
why?
a convertible anymore, was
Yeah, it wasn't a convertible, but why?
Okay.
Why? Why? Just why? Just get rid of it. And people used it. Well, on November 22nd, 1963, on the Cronkite Show, these guys were supposed to make their
Beatles.
primetime debut. The Beatles' first American TV exposure, November 22nd, the CBS Morning News with Mike Wallace. Wallace and his producers did a profile on the Beatles in a segment that was scheduled to be repeated to a much wider audience on the Cronkite Show. It was shelved. It would be seen on December 10th. The Mercury 7, actually there were 6 of them, Deke Slayton never made it up because of a health problem. They complete their mission. The space race Cold War was heating up with the US and the USSR wanting to land a man on the moon first. The Mercury missions ended after NASA proved it could get the astronauts in orbit around the Earth. The Soviet Union put a woman in space, but Congress was not sure if they wanted to put a man on the moon and if it was worth the money to get there. Kennedy might have had to face an uphill battle, and he survived, to get the money to put people on the moon by the end of the 1960s. That was the very corrupt Prime Minister of Malaysia, me and Najib Razak in 2010. And the reason I bring up Malaysia was on September 16th. Malaysia is formed through the merger of the Federation of Malaya and the British Crown Colony of Singapore in North Borneo. The world's a dangerous place in 1963. On September 25th in the Dominican Republic, Juan Bosch is disposed by a coup d'etat led by the military civilian, with civilian support. They're still fighting in South Yemen 61 years later. October 14th, revolution starts in Radfan, South Yemen against British colonial rule. In Africa, the Organization of African States is founded. 32 countries are there, but 30 join them. They meet in Ethiopia to form the Organization of African Unity. That was something W.D.B. Du Bois proposed. Great Britain granted Kenya independence within the British Commonwealth December 12th. Michael DeBakey came
Oh,
up
yeah.
with the artificial heart pump on July 16th. And whether Robert F. Kennedy Jr. likes it or not, approval was given for a vaccine against measles. John Enders developed a vaccine. In Yugoslavia, Tito decides he's going to be the dictator for life, or president for life. Yugoslavia became the Social Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in April. The changes to the European nation's name in Tito's authority, part of several socialist reforms added into the country's constitution that year. I don't know. Think portable TV will ever catch on? What do you think? Think portable TV is ever going to catch on, or it's just a fad in 1963? There it is, some guy in the hospital watching TV. Okay, we end with Camelot. Camelot. Anybody see Camelot? Robert Goulet was in Camelot, wasn't he? Robert Goulet. Life in Camelot. Life magazine. The Kennedy years. It wasn't Camelot. It was made up. It's November 29th. Jacqueline Kennedy, 4 days after her husband's burial and the widowed mother of 2 children, invited her old friend, the Life magazine journalist Theodore H. White, whose real name was Theodore H. Weiss, anglicized the name, to the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. She wanted White, to help rescue her husband's legacy, because the legacy wasn't all that good.
No.
Bay of Pigs was a failure. He tried to get Medicare passed, couldn't do it. Civil rights record, thin as could be. He started the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, aiming the missiles at Turkey. And both Khrushchev and Kennedy saved face by backing down the Cuban Missile Crisis. There wasn't all that much there, and Jackie Kennedy knew it. So she says to White, help me, help rescue my husband's legacy. Link his presidency to King Arthur and the Round Table. Okay? Why? What was the big show on Broadway at the time? Camelot. Camelot was running on Broadway. The lines he loved to hear were, don't let it be forgotten that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. John Kennedy hated musicals. The long-term impact in 1963, and that's the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that was his home base. Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Law in 1964. The Beatles conquered America in 1964, and today there is a new Beatle album out. A remix of the 1964 albums. They came out today. 60 years later, the Beatles are still selling records and streaming. 1 billion times their recordings have been streamed. 1 billion times. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would be killed in 1968. Saddam Hussein would grant power in Iraq in 1968. Hafez al-Assad would seize power in Syria in 1969. The United States would escalate its Vietnam involvement in 1964. The Warren Commission said Oswald acted alone in assassinating JFK. Khrushchev would be ousted in 1964, and man would land on the moon in 1969. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn to talk. I am